Now we're going to be looking at solving second degree equations where the variable x is squared, also called a quadratic equation. And the first thing we want to recognize is what's called the general form, where it's written as the following. Notice there's got to be a 0 on one side of the equation. Now there are several ways to solve a quadratic equation depending on the type of equation you have. So let's get right into it and start looking at those processes. One is to use what's called the zero factor property. And that simply says that if you have a product equaling 0, then either one of those factors or both has to equal 0. That's not true with any other number. For example, I know that 3 times 2 equals 6, but neither of those factors are 6, okay? But if I'm setting something equal to 0, then one of the two factors at least has to be 0, and that extends to more than two factors. Okay, so what do? First thing we have to do to use the zero factor property is to get a 0 on one side of the equation. And sometimes students forget this process, but again, as we just saw, it doesn't work unless you have 0 on one side of that equation. And then we factor, because in order to use this property, we have to have it written in factored form. Here it looks like I can pull out a 3. Let's do that to make our work much easier. You don't have to, but you can see, I think, already that it's going to be much easier to factor that. And I'm going to leave the factoring part to you, but this is a pretty straightforward trinomial. Now, double check your multiplication. Make sure I get plus 6x plus 7 minus 1 does give me the right middle term and the right third term. If your factoring's wrong, obviously your solution will be wrong. Okay, and then we solve it by setting each variable factor equal to 0. So this equation will have a solution if either x plus 7 equals 0 or x minus 1 equals 0. I'm sorry, this is negative 7 here, and this is 1. So the solution is negative 7 and 1. Okay? And you can check those. I'm not going to take the time. But in quadratic equations, when we're just factoring like this, we don't usually have an issue of extraneous solutions. Okay? And one other thing to mention, what about the 3? Why did I not take care of the 3? Because that is not able to be equal to 0. I could set that factor equal to 0, but that's nonsense. And so I don't have to worry about a numerical factor, just factors involving the variables. And again, I can't emphasize enough that the right-hand side has to be equal to 0 before you factor. All right, let's look at another example. All right, now don't make the mistake here of saying, oh, okay, it's a product, so I set each factor equal to 0. All right, the issue is that the right-hand side is not 0 initially. So our first step is to set it equal to 0 and then to rewrite and refactor. You cannot just set each factor equal to 8. It doesn't work. Okay? So we have to do what? We multiply that out. X squared plus 3x minus 4x is minus x minus 12 minus 8 equals 0. And I look at that and say, oh, okay, I can factor that. X minus 5, x plus 4 is equal to 0. So what are my solutions? I set the individual factors equal to 0. or x plus 4 equals 0, which means that x equals negative 4. Okay, so my solutions, and again you can check that they fit. In fact, let's just do that really quick. Let's check it. Let's check one of the solutions. Let's check x equals negative 4. Okay, what do I do again? I go back to my original equation and plug in negative 4. And notice that I get minus 1 times minus 8, and it equals 8, which is the right-hand side of the equation. So that works, and you can check x equals 5. Okay, great. All right, that works for some examples. Another type which we're not able to solve directly by factoring, we can use the square root principle. And that is if u squared equals c, where c is greater than or equal to 0, that's important, then u is going to be plus or minus the square root of c. And we know that because, for example, if x squared equals 4, that equation has two solutions. X equals the square root of 4, or x equals minus the square root of 4. Because if I square either 2 or negative 2, I will get 4. Now again, the square root of 4 is not plus or minus 2. The square root of 4 is just 2. But the equation has two solutions. All right, so when we're looking at an equation like this, we can solve using that square root principle. Okay, and how do we do that? We simply take the square root of both sides, or we just use this directly. So we can say square root of x plus 2 squared equals plus or minus the square root of 5. And that, of course, is just going to be x plus 2, which is plus or minus the square root of 5. And your textbook calls this extracting the root. Okay, so when you're reading the text, you'll see that term. Okay, now, what are the solutions? Notice if I bring it over to the other side, I get negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 5. What does that mean? X equals negative 2 plus the square root of 5, or x equals negative 2 minus the square root of 5. And there are two solutions. This is a perfectly valid way of writing this. In WebAssign, they may want both solutions written out separately. Just read the directions and they'll tell you exactly what to do. Thank you.